Thank you very much. It's good to be here today. And I'm going to make believe that I can see. I'm going to be talking about state sovereignty from a 10th Amendment perspective. By itself alone, it should be enough to almost make one consider that this country was founded by divine intervention. That at one small point in time, in one tiny geographic location, you had people like George Washington, James Madison, George Mason, Patrick Henry, Thomas Jefferson come together to establish a new order for the ages, and they did nothing less than that. Just consider for a minute the nicknames that history has bestowed on these people. George Washington, the father of the nation. James Madison, the father of the Constitution. George Mason, the father of the Bill of Rights. Patrick Henry, the voice of the Revolution. And what can we say about Jefferson? In his treatise Common Sense, Thomas Paine talked about how monarchies are first started. And he said that typically a monarchy is started by a dominant thug taking over from all the other thugs. George F. Will was a little bit kinder when he said that the founding of most countries came out of a fog where you had some form of tribalism where a dominant tribe established a monarchy, and at some point that was determined to be a country, and they went from there. And talking about the unusual and unique founding of this country, George F. Will said, unlike other countries, the United States was formed by a vision, and the vision was provided by Thomas Jefferson. But our founders were not a homogeneous group of people. They had fights, they had disagreements, they fought over issues, they had personality battles. I think Thomas Jefferson was always a little envious of Patrick Henry because the people were very fond of Patrick Henry. Maybe Jefferson was too much of an intellectual or an elitist to have that same kind of following at the grassroots level. And early on in our country's history, we began to see party politics, the Federalists versus the Democrat Republicans. But there were some things that united our founders. And I think that one thing you could say is they were very well educated, they understood their history, and arguably the thing they all shared that contributed to the founding of this country is that they did not want to see what happened here that had happened in Europe. They knew that for centuries Europe had been embroiled in one war after another. King against king, king against pope, pope and king against king. They did not want to bring that to this country. So our founders were united in a common fear of the centralization of power. In creating a system of government in this country, they sought to put particular bulwarks in place, what I would call bulwarks of liberty, that would make it impossible to centralize power. Bulwarks like natural rights. This is the idea that rights come from God or nature's God, and they do not come from government. Number two, popular sovereignty. Under the English parliamentary system, the people are sovereign on election day. And after election day, after the polls close, they cease to be sovereign, and for that matter, they cease to exist politically until the next election day. That was never the understanding here. In this country, the people are sovereign, period. The rule of law rather than the rule of men. Federalism. This was a key point in the founders' ideas for the founding of this country because federalism is the vertical dispersal of power. It's the vertical dispersal of power between different layers of government. One of the key components of federalism was the fact that our United States Senate, what the senators were originally selected by the state legislators, not the people. And the purpose of that was that the states would be represented and the state interests would be represented and federalism would be represented in Congress. Separation of powers. Whereas I said federalism was the vertical dispersal of power, separation of powers is the horizontal dispersal of powers between a legislator, a legislative branch, an executive, and a judiciary. So our founders did just about everything they could possibly do to break the power up and disperse it between different competing entities. Some historians have even gone so far as to say the idea of the separation of church and state was part of this effort, that the founders understood that over time both the church and the state would become powerful institutions, and they wanted them competing with each other rather than teaming up with each other to suppress the people. Well, things have not worked out exactly like the founders planned. We ratified a Constitution. We have a 9th and 10th Amendment. And we're about as far away from the 9th and 10th Amendments today as we could possibly get. The 9th Amendment is the amendment that says, in this document, the Constitution, we made no effort whatsoever to enumerate all the powers of the people. The Bill of Rights enumerates some of the powers, but no effort was made to enumerate all the power. The 10th Amendment, on the other hand, says we did enumerate all the powers of government. And if the power for the central government is not listed in this document, they don't have it. So these were two key components. In fact, some people doubted originally that we would have a ratified Constitution because initially there was not a Bill of Rights, and initially these components were not in the Constitution. The 9th and 10th Amendments briefly encapsulate the twofold theory that of the Constitution. The purpose of the Constitution is to protect rights, which do not originate. The purpose of the Constitution is to protect rights, which do not originate in government. And the powers of the national government are limited to only those delegated by the Constitution. Jefferson thought the 10th Amendment was so important that he described it as the cornerstone of the entire document. He described the 10th Amendment as being the cornerstone of the Constitution. By the end of the Constitutional Convention, it was already understood that the Constitution was a federal one, granting the government only certain powers, rather than a national one in which the central government was able to exercise whatever powers they so sought to exercise. The extent of the federal government's supremacy, quote, was to be confined to the powers delegated by the Constitution, the Federalist, and by that I mean Madison, Jay, and Hamilton. At the time the Constitution was being considered for ratification, and of course they were trying to make the argument to ratify the Constitution, they wrote that each state would be as one of 13 parties to a contract, and that the federal government would have only the powers it was expressly delegated. This principle was also made explicit by the ratification of the 10th Amendment. Jefferson explained in the Federalist number 45, the powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. Those which are to remain with the state's government are numerous and indefinite. The former will be exercised principally on external objects as war, peace negotiation, and foreign commerce. The powers reserved to the several states will extend to all objects which, in the ordinary course of affairs, concern the lives, liberties, and properties of the people, and that the internal order and prosperity of the state. So the federal government was supposed to have a limited and fairly minor role. The state governments were going to be the predominant entity of government that handled our lives and property and protecting our lives and property. The 10th Amendment was the written guarantee of the central principle that state ratifying conventions had been assured of when they were being urged to ratify the Constitution, that the proposed federal government will only have those powers granted to it and no others. Things began to fall apart pretty quickly. When John Adams was president, you'll remember he was our second president, Adams was responsible for getting the Alien and Sedition Acts passed. These were acts that you could be imprisoned or fined for criticizing the government. When Jefferson became the next president, he released everybody in prison that was in prison due to the Sedition Acts, and anyone who had been fined, the government repaid those people with interest. Jefferson was that upset about the Alien and Sedition Acts. Jefferson is the author of the Kentucky Resolutions. Now, the Kentucky Resolutions were a document to come out and attack what had been done with the Alien and Sedition Acts. As the author of the Kentucky Resolutions, he declared that, quote, "Whensoever the general government assumes undelegated powers, its acts are unauthoritative, void, and of no force," unquote. In essence, the state could nullify or interpose its sovereignty against a federal law if it deemed the law to be unconstitutional. And that was seen as the role of the states back then. The states had a role to make sure that the federal government did not overstep its bounds. In short, the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions of 1798, along with a follow-up report of 1800 in the Kentucky resolutions of 1799, held that, one, the federal government had been created when sovereign states granted a few enumerated powers. Two, any powers not so delegated remained reserved to the states or the people, a point expressly stated with the passing of the Bill of Rights in the 10th Amendment. And three, should the federal government exercise a power that had not been delegated, the states ought to interpose, that is, they ought to stand between the citizens of their state and the federal government's unconstitutional law on the other side.